Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel Frontline News. Today we're diving into a story that's been quietly unfolding in Eastern Europe, one that could shake Russia's power structure to its core. Putin's grip on Kaliningrad, that isolated Russian enclave wedged between NATO nations, is slipping. The Kremlin's control over this strategic region is weakening, and the consequences could be enormous for Russia, for Europe, and for global security. What's happening inside Kaliningrad tells us more about the future of Putin's empire than many realize. Kaliningrad has always been an odd piece of geography. It's a fragment of Russia that's completely cut off from the mainland, surrounded by Lithuania and Poland, both NATO members. It's home to around 500,000 people and some of Russia's most important military assets, including nuclear, capable missiles and the headquarters of the Baltic fleet. For years, the Kremlin has treated it like a fortress, a symbol of Russian power and defiance. But beneath that image of strength, things are beginning to crumble. Economic isolation is the first crack in the wall. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Western sanctions hit hard, and Kaliningrad was among the first to feel the pain. Trade routes that once flowed freely through Lithuania were restricted. The EU allowed only certain goods to pass through, cutting off vital supplies and creating shortages of food, fuel, and building materials. Prices in Kaliningrad skyrocketed. For residents, daily life became a struggle, and anger toward Moscow quietly started to grow. Even though Russia tried to downplay the issue, the effects were undeniable. Factories slowed production, small businesses closed, and unemployment climbed. People who had once viewed Moscow as their lifeline began to see it as a distant, uncaring power. The Kremlin responded by pumping in subsidies and propaganda, trying to convince locals that everything was under control. But the truth was that control was slipping, and the cracks couldn't be hidden forever. Another major problem is logistics. Kaliningrad's isolation makes it dependent on the goodwill of Lithuania and Poland for overland transit. Those countries, being NATO members, have no obligation to make life easier for Moscow. In fact, they've used their position to apply pressure. Every delay at the border, every customs check, every transport ban is a reminder that Kaliningrad's survival depends not on Russian strength, but on Western tolerance. That reality deeply undermines the Kremlin's image of dominance. The military situation adds another layer to this story. Kaliningrad has long been described as a militarized island. Russia has deployed advanced missile systems like the Iskander and S-400 there, giving it the ability to strike deep into Europe. But maintaining those forces has become increasingly difficult. With resources stretched thin by the war in Ukraine, resupplying and reinforcing Kaliningrad is a logistical nightmare. NATO surveillance has intensified, and every Russian shipment is closely monitored. Soldiers stationed in the enclave face shortages too. Reports have emerged of poor living conditions, outdated equipment, and low morale among troops. Many servicemen were redeployed to Ukraine, leaving the Baltic fleet undermanned and vulnerable. For the first time in decades, Kaliningrad doesn't feel like a symbol of strength. It feels like a burden Russia can barely afford to maintain. On top of the economic and military strain, there's the political mood inside Kaliningrad itself. The people there are more connected to Europe than most Russians. They travel to Poland and Lithuania, consume Western media, and see firsthand the difference in living standards. Over the years, a quiet European identity has been forming. It's not open rebellion, but it's a growing distance from Moscow's worldview. The Kremlin's propaganda machine has tried to suppress this sentiment, but the internet makes that nearly impossible. Younger generations in Kaliningrad have started questioning the Kremlin's policies. Many of them don't see Ukraine as an enemy. They're more interested in freedom, economic opportunity, and stability than in Putin's vision of restoring a Soviet-style empire. This ideological divide is becoming more pronounced, especially as the rest of Russia becomes more repressive. The contrast between Kaliningrad's European surroundings and Moscow's tightening control is driving quiet discontent. Energy has become another flashpoint. Kaliningrad used to depend on Lithuania for its electricity supply, but after years of warnings, Russia built new power plants to ensure energy independence. However, these facilities are costly to run and often inefficient. Fuel shortages have led to power cuts in some areas, sparking frustration among residents. The Kremlin boasts about energy security, but the reality on the ground is far from stable. The geopolitical situation makes things even more complicated. As NATO strengthens its presence in Poland and the Baltic states, Kaliningrad finds itself encircled by the West. Every NATO exercise, every troop movement, is seen by Moscow as a threat. Yet from the perspective of those surrounding nations, it's Kaliningrad that poses the danger, a heavily armed Russian enclave within their borders. This standoff has turned the region into one of the tensest flashpoints in Europe. But while Putin wants to project confidence, he knows Kaliningrad's vulnerability is a real strategic weakness. If Russia's relationship with the West continues to deteriorate, the enclave could become isolated to the point of crisis. Imagine a scenario where Lithuania closes its borders completely, or NATO imposes tighter controls on Russian shipping in the Baltic Sea. Kaliningrad would be cut off from supplies, unable to sustain its military presence for long. That's the nightmare scenario for the Kremlin, and it's not far-fetched anymore. Russia has tried to counter this by strengthening its naval connections. Supply lines by sea have increased, but they're expensive, slow, and risky, especially under Western surveillance. NATO's naval dominance in the Baltic means that any major Russian movement is quickly detected. The days when Moscow could operate freely in the region are over. Every ship entering Kaliningrad's port now passes through a virtual gauntlet of NATO eyes and sensors. Meanwhile, Lithuania and Poland have found new ways to put pressure on Russia without direct confrontation. By tightening customs rules, monitoring goods more closely, and coordinating with EU sanctions, they've made life in Kaliningrad increasingly difficult. And because Putin can't afford to appear weak, he can't retaliate in any meaningful way. Every diplomatic protest from Moscow sounds hollow when the world can see how dependent Kaliningrad really is. Inside the Kremlin, this situation is seen as a humiliation. Putin has always prided himself on restoring Russia's strength after the chaos of the 1990s. But Kaliningrad exposes the limits of that power. It shows that Russia's empire is held together not by loyalty or prosperity, but by fear and propaganda. Once that grip weakens, regions like Kaliningrad could drift away from Moscow's control, first in spirit, then possibly in fact. There's even speculation among analysts that if Russia's central authority continues to weaken, through economic collapse or internal unrest, Kaliningrad could push for greater autonomy. That doesn't necessarily mean independence, but it could mean defying Moscow's policies, establishing closer ties with Europe, or resisting military orders. The idea would have been unthinkable a decade ago, but now it's openly discussed in some circles. The war in Ukraine has accelerated this erosion of control. Moscow has diverted so many resources, both financial and military, that peripheral regions are feeling abandoned. Kaliningrad officials have quietly complained about lack of support, while Moscow demands unwavering loyalty. It's a familiar pattern. Putin's regime demands total obedience but offers little in return. Over time, that equation stops working. Western intelligence agencies are watching Kaliningrad closely. They know it's both a threat and an opportunity. A weak, Unstable Kaliningrad is dangerous. It could lead to unpredictable military escalations, but it's also a sign that Russia's influence in Eastern Europe is fading. NATO doesn't need to invade or provoke. It just needs to wait as Russia's own system corrodes from within. For Putin, losing control of Kaliningrad would be more than just a military setback. It would be a psychological blow. The enclave represents his vision of Russia as a great power encircled but unbroken. If that symbol begins to crumble, it sends a message to other regions that Moscow's reach isn't eternal. It would expose the myth of absolute control that Putin has built his image upon. The Kremlin's response has been predictable: more propaganda, more fear, and more repression. Russian media insists that Kaliningrad is thriving, that Western sanctions have failed, that locals are loyal to Moscow, but the truth on the ground tells another story. Social media posts from residents speak of shortages, frustration, and despair. Independent journalists who try to report on it face censorship or worse. As Russia's war in Ukraine drags on, the economic burden grows heavier. The Kremlin's priorities are clear. Funding the war effort takes precedence over everything else. Regions like Kaliningrad are left to fend for themselves, even as they're expected to project loyalty. This imbalance is unsustainable. When people feel abandoned, loyalty fades. Over the next few years, Kaliningrad could become a test case for the future of Russia's empire. Can the Kremlin maintain control over a distant region surrounded by adversaries, cut off from resources, and increasingly disillusioned with Moscow's leadership? Or will it slowly drift toward a new identity, one that looks westward instead of eastward? History suggests that when empires start to crack, it often begins at the edges. Kaliningrad may be small, but it symbolizes something much larger: the limits of Russian power in a changing world. Putin can deploy troops, build bases, and issue threats, but he can't stop the flow of ideas, the spread of discontent, or the simple human desire for a better life. Every month that passes, Russia's isolation deepens. The sanctions bite harder, trade routes shrink, and trust between Moscow and its regions erodes. The Kremlin's control mechanisms, fear, loyalty, and money are all under strain. Kaliningrad is both a mirror and a warning. It reflects what's happening across Russia, where the old system of centralized power is starting to falter under the weight of its own contradictions. For now, Putin will hold on. He'll send more officials, issue more decrees, and remind everyone that Kaliningrad is Russia's land forever. But behind the speeches and the slogans, reality tells a different story. The grip is weakening, the confidence is gone, and the people of Kaliningrad can feel it. If the war continues to drag Russia into deeper chaos, if the economy keeps shrinking, and if regional discontent keeps rising, Kaliningrad could one day become the symbol of how Putin's empire began to unravel. From the western edge, where the illusion of control finally gave way to reality. And when that happens, it won't just be about one region. It will mark a turning point in modern history, the moment when Russia's decades of domination began to fade, and the world finally saw the cracks in the fortress that Putin built. The story of Kaliningrad isn't over yet, but one thing is certain: the Kremlin's grip is loosening, and no amount of propaganda can hide it anymore.